They emerged from the vast, unforgiving steppes of Central Asia, a nomadic force that would redefine the scale of conquest. The Mongol Empire, forged by the strategic genius of Genghis Khan, became the largest contiguous land empire in history. Their strength was not just in numbers, but in a revolutionary approach to warfare, centered on unparalleled equestrian skill and psychological terror. Before attacking a major city, they would decimate the surrounding villages, driving waves of terrified refugees that would strain the city's resources and shatter its morale. Their policy was brutally simple: surrender unconditionally or face complete annihilation. Cities that resisted, like the great centers of learning in Persia and the Kievan Rus, were razed to the ground, their populations systematically slaughtered. In cities like Nishapur and Herat, chronicles record death tolls in the millions, with entire civilizations erased from existence. Engineers and artisans were often spared, only to be enslaved and forcibly relocated to serve the empire's needs. The rest of the population, men, women, and children, faced methodical extermination, a calculated act to prevent any possibility of future rebellion. The wave of destruction left a power vacuum across Eurasia, shattering established orders from China to Europe. Yet this devastation also paved the way for the Pax Mongolica, a century of relative peace that secured trade routes and facilitated unprecedented cultural exchange. The sheer scale of the violence left a demographic scar on the world, with some estimates suggesting the global population was reduced by as much as 11%. The empire itself eventually fractured, its vast territories splintering into successor states that were gradually absorbed by the cultures they had once conquered. Genghis Khan's name is no longer just that of a man. It has become a synonym for conquest itself. It proves that the very same forces capable of unparalleled destruction can also unintentionally forge the framework of a new world. In the ancient Near East, one empire elevated cruelty to a form of statecraft. The Neo-Assyrian Empire did not just conquer, it sought to dominate the minds of its subjects through calculated, publicized terror. Their military was one of the most effective war machines of its time, mastering siege warfare and combined arms tactics. But their true innovation was psychological warfare, where brutality was not a byproduct of war, but its central weapon. The Assyrian kings openly boasted of their methods in monumental inscriptions and palace reliefs. They documented flaying rebel leaders and draping their skins on city walls, impaling captives on stakes around a conquered city, and creating piles of severed heads. King Ashurnasirpal II recorded his actions with chilling pride, describing how he burned children alive and cut off the noses, ears, and limbs of captured soldiers. This wasn't random violence, it was a broadcast. The goal was to make the price of resistance so unimaginably high that other cities would submit out of sheer fear, saving the Assyrians the cost of a prolonged siege. Beyond the battlefield, they practiced mass deportation on an unprecedented scale, forcibly relocating hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people. This policy shattered local identities and broke the will to rebel by severing people from their ancestral lands. The empire's reliance on terror eventually backfired. Its extreme brutality fostered a deep-seated hatred among its subjects. When a coalition of subjugated peoples, led by the Babylonians and Medes, rose against them, they showed the Assyrians no mercy, culminating in the final destruction of their capital, Nineveh, in 612 BCE. Today, the Assyrian Empire is a case study in the limits of power derived from fear. An empire built solely on terror will eventually be consumed by the very hatred it cultivates. He emerged from the fractured remnants of the Mongol Empire, a Turco-Mongol conqueror who claimed spiritual succession to Genghis Khan. Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, unleashed a wave of conquest in the late 14th century that was, in some ways, even more focused in its cruelty. Timur was a brilliant military strategist, but his campaigns were distinguished by a systematic use of terror that was both a psychological weapon and a calling card. He did not merely seek submission, he sought to make examples of those who defied him. His methods were horrifically inventive. After conquering a city that had resisted, he would order the construction of towers or pyramids made entirely from the severed heads of its citizens. In Isfahan, after a revolt, he reportedly ordered the massacre of the population, resulting in the creation of 28 towers built from an estimated 70,000 skulls. During his sack of Baghdad in 1401, he commanded each of his soldiers to return with at least 2 severed heads, leading to the slaughter of tens of thousands. Other accounts describe his armies burying thousands of soldiers alive, or cementing living people into walls. Unlike the Mongols, who often spared artisans for their skills, Timur's massacres were sometimes indiscriminate, though he too would deport the most skilled craftsmen to adorn his magnificent capital at Samarkand. His campaigns are estimated to have caused the deaths of up to 17 million people, roughly 5% of the world's population at the time. The Timurid Empire, for all its splendor, was a personal project built on fear and conquest. It did not long survive its founder's death, quickly fracturing as the personal loyalties and terror that held it together dissolved. The pyramids of skulls are long gone, absorbed back into the earth. But Timur's name remains a benchmark for destruction, proving that even the most awe-inspiring empires can be built on nothing more than the will of a single ruthless individual. In the Valley of Mexico, the Aztec Triple Alliance built a dazzling empire centered on the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan. Theirs was a civilization of sophisticated agriculture, complex theology, and a rigid social hierarchy. The empire was not a directly controlled territory, but a system of tribute enforced by a formidable military. Subjugated city-states were forced to pay taxes in goods, from precious feathers and gold to simple foodstuffs. But the most terrifying form of tribute was human. Aztec cosmology demanded regular, large-scale human sacrifice to appease their gods, particularly Huitzilopochtli, the god of sun and war, who required a constant supply of human hearts to keep the sun rising. This religious belief fueled a state of perpetual, low-intensity conflict known as the Flower Wars, fought not for territory, but for the express purpose of capturing prisoners for the sacrificial altar. Tens of thousands of individuals, mostly captured warriors, but also civilians, were taken to the tops of pyramids, their chests opened with obsidian knives, and their still-beating hearts offered to the heavens. The scale was immense. A single temple reconsecration in 1487 is said to have involved the sacrifice of thousands over 4 days. This system of rule through fear and ritual violence created deep resentment among the empire's vassal states. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in 1519, they found a population of potential allies eager to overthrow their masters. The fall of the Aztec Empire was not just a Spanish conquest, it was a massive internal rebellion, exploited and led by a small band of outsiders. The great temples were torn down, and the empire that had terrorized a continent was systematically dismantled, its people devastated by new diseases and subjugation. The Aztec Empire is now a foundation, buried literally and figuratively beneath one of the world's largest modern cities. An empire that feeds on its own people will eventually create the allies that ensure its destruction. Fueled by a desire for God, gold, and glory, the Spanish Empire expanded with breathtaking speed across the Americas. It became one of the first truly global empires, built on the wealth of conquered civilizations and the exploitation of continents. While the conquest itself was marked by military campaigns against the Aztec and Inca empires, the true brutality of the Spanish system was more insidious and structural. It was a bureaucratic empire of extraction. The empire's economic engine was the forced labor of indigenous populations. Under systems like the encomienda and later the mita, native communities were compelled to work in horrific conditions, particularly in the silver mines of Potosi and Zacatecas. Millions perished from overwork, malnutrition, and accidents in these mines, which supplied the silver that funded Spain's European wars and global trade. This physical exploitation was justified by a rigid racial caste system and enforced by religious authority. While figures like Bartolomé de las Casas argued for the humanity of the indigenous peoples, the system of economic demand consistently overrode moral concerns. The most devastating impact, however, came from disease. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, unintentionally introduced by the Europeans, swept through populations with no immunity, causing a demographic collapse of catastrophic proportions. In many regions, upwards of 90% of the indigenous population perished within a century of contact. This great dying was not a deliberate act of war, but it was a direct consequence of the invasion and colonization that defined the empire. Centuries of exploitation and a rigid social hierarchy eventually led to widespread independence movements across Latin America in the early 19th century, causing the vast empire to crumble from within. The Spanish Empire is now a linguistic and cultural ghost, its language spoken by 500 million people and its colonial architecture still framing modern cities. It proves that an empire can inflict its greatest devastation not through the sword, but through the silent workings of disease and economic demand. It was not an empire forged by a nation, but the personal property of a single man. The Congo Free State, an area 76 times larger than Belgium, was the private fiefdom of King Leopold II, acquired through deception and diplomatic maneuvering. Leopold presented his project to the world as a humanitarian mission to end the slave trade and bring civilization to Central Africa. In reality, it was a smokescreen for one of the most ruthless colonial extraction systems ever devised. The global boom in rubber for tires and industrial use turned the Congo's vast rainforests into a massive labor camp. Leopold's private army, the Force Publique, was tasked with enforcing impossible rubber quotas on Congolese villages. Failure to meet these quotas was met with extreme violence, including murder, flogging, and the burning of entire villages. To ensure that bullets were not wasted on hunting, soldiers were often required to present a severed hand from a victim for every cartridge spent. This practice led to widespread mutilation, with hands becoming a grotesque form of currency to account for killings. Women and children were held hostage to coerce men into the forest to gather rubber. The system was designed for maximum profit with zero regard for human life. Disease, starvation, and direct violence led to a demographic collapse, with estimates of the death toll ranging from 5 to 13 million people. International outrage, fueled by the work of journalists like E.D. Morel and the photographic evidence of missionaries, eventually exposed the horrors. Under immense pressure, Leopold was forced to relinquish his personal control, and the territory was annexed by the Belgian state in 1908, becoming the Belgian Congo. The Congo Free State is now a warning, a historical precedent for state-sponsored corporate greed. As pioneers of the Age of Discovery, the Portuguese were the first to build a vast sea-based empire linking continents. Their goal was not land conquest in the traditional sense, but control of the lucrative maritime trade routes, particularly the spice trade from Asia. To achieve this, they established a network of fortified trading posts and coastal enclaves. Their method of control was not through diplomacy, but through overwhelming naval firepower and a policy of terror directed at rival merchants and port cities. Commanders like Afonso de Albuquerque carved out the empire by systematically destroying competing trade networks. They would seize key ports like Goa, Malacca, and Hormuz, often with extreme violence against the local population, to create a chokehold on the Indian Ocean. However, the most enduring and brutal aspect of the Portuguese Empire was its central role in the transatlantic slave trade. Portugal was the largest single participant in this trade, responsible for the forced transportation of nearly 5 million Africans. People were captured, branded, and packed into unimaginably horrific conditions for the Middle Passage, primarily to work on the sugar plantations of Brazil. The death rate on these voyages was staggering, and life on the plantations was short and brutal, driven by the insatiable European demand for sugar. This system created a society built on the foundations of human chattel slavery, the effects of which would last for centuries. The empire's wealth was directly extracted from the labor and lives of millions of enslaved people. The empire itself lingered longer than most, only collapsing completely in 1974 with a military coup in Portugal that led to the independence of its African colonies. The Portuguese Empire is now a vast diaspora, a network of shared language and complex cultural heritage spanning 4 continents. In its final decades, the once mighty Ottoman Empire became known as the sick man of Europe. Facing internal decay and external pressures, the state turned to a toxic mix of nationalism and religious extremism to maintain control over its fragmenting, multi-ethnic territories. This desperation fueled a series of violent episodes against its minority populations. The policies of Sultan Abdul Hamid II in the 1890s, aimed at reasserting Islamic authority, led to the Hamidian massacres. Over 2 years, state-sanctioned pogroms resulted in the deaths of up to 300,000 Armenians and other Christians, like the Assyrians. These events were a grim foreshadowing of what was to come. With the rise of the Young Turks and their nationalist Committee of Union and Progress, this persecution was institutionalized and escalated dramatically during World War I. Beginning in 1915, the Ottoman government orchestrated a systematic campaign against its Armenian population. Citing fears of collaboration with Russia, the state ordered the deportation of Armenian men, women, and children into the Syrian desert on death marches. They were deprived of food and water and subjected to robbery and violence by guards and roaming bands. An estimated 1.5 million Armenians perished through mass killings, starvation, and exhaustion in what is now widely recognized as the Armenian Genocide. Similar campaigns of persecution and ethnic cleansing were also directed against the empire's Greek and Assyrian populations. Defeat in World War I led to the empire's complete dissolution, and from its ashes, the modern Republic of Turkey was born, founded on a new, homogeneous national identity. The late Ottoman Empire is now a subject of intense political and historical debate, particularly concerning the official recognition of its final acts. Driven by a desire to avoid Western colonization and secure resources, Imperial Japan embarked on a rapid campaign of industrialization and militarization in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. It sought to build its own empire in Asia, under the banner of liberating the continent from European rule. This imperial ambition was underpinned by a powerful ideology of racial supremacy and emperor worship. It portrayed the Japanese as a divinely chosen people destined to lead the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. This ideology found its most horrific expression during the Second Sino-Japanese War. In late 1937, after capturing the Chinese capital of Nanking, Japanese troops engaged in a 6-week period of mass murder and war crimes. Hundreds of thousands of disarmed soldiers and civilians were killed, and widespread looting and assault occurred in what became known as the Rape of Nanking. Across its conquered territories, the Imperial Japanese Army implemented brutal policies. This included the forced recruitment of comfort women from Korea, China, and Southeast Asia to serve in military brothels, and the notorious Unit 731, where Japanese doctors conducted horrifying human experiments on prisoners of war and civilians. Allied prisoners of war were subjected to forced labor in inhumane conditions, such as the construction of the Burma Railway, where thousands died from starvation, disease, and mistreatment. The empire's militarism demanded absolute sacrifice from its own people and inflicted untold suffering on others. This fanatical devotion culminated in the use of kamikaze attacks in the final stages of the Pacific War. The empire's ambitions came to a sudden and devastating end in August 1945 with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the subsequent surrender of Japan. Imperial Japan is now a former identity, replaced by one of the world's most pacifist and economically advanced nations. The nation's identity is not permanent, and that the most aggressive forms of militarism can be completely sublimated within a single generation. Born from the ashes of the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union was founded on a revolutionary promise to create the world's first communist state, a workers' paradise free from class exploitation. But the pursuit of this utopia required the systematic dismantling of the old world by any means necessary. Under Joseph Stalin, the state's power became absolute. His drive to rapidly industrialize the nation and collectivize its agriculture led to policies of extreme brutality directed inward, against the Soviet Union's own citizens. The forced collectivization of agriculture met with fierce resistance, particularly in Ukraine. The state responded by seizing grain and imposing impossible quotas, leading to a man-made famine, the Holodomor, that killed millions through starvation. This was part of a wider war against the peasantry, or kulaks, who were deemed class enemies and subjected to mass arrests and deportations. The state's machinery of terror was the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps where millions of political prisoners, criminals, and ethnic minorities were sent. Here, they were worked to death through overwork, malnutrition, and exposure in the harshest regions of the country. During the Great Purge of the late 1930s, Stalin's paranoia turned on the Communist Party, the military, and the intelligentsia, resulting in mass executions and disappearances. After World War II, this model of control was exported to the nations of the Eastern Bloc. The Soviet Empire was maintained not through direct rule, but through puppet governments and the constant threat of military intervention, as seen in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. The state controlled every aspect of life, using the secret police to crush dissent and maintain its grip on power for decades. Economic stagnation and internal pressures eventually caused the entire system to collapse in 1991, freeing its satellite states and splintering the Union itself. The Soviet Union is now a memory, its statues toppled and its ideology largely discredited. An empire that declares war on its own people, on their property, their traditions, and their very thoughts, will eventually exhaust itself into oblivion. In the aftermath of World War I and the Great Depression, Nazi Germany emerged with a promise to restore national pride and create a new empire. This Third Reich was built upon an ideology of racial purity and territorial expansion, known as Lebensraum, or living space. From the moment it took power, the Nazi state began to institutionalize its ideology. The Nuremberg laws stripped Jewish citizens of their rights, beginning a systematic process of segregation and persecution that would escalate into the defining crime of the 20th century. The regime's brutality was industrialized with chilling efficiency. Across occupied Europe, it established a network of concentration and extermination camps designed for slave labor and mass murder. Millions of Jews, Slavs, Romani people, political dissidents, homosexuals, and people with disabilities were systematically transported to these facilities. In extermination camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, and Sobibor, the state implemented the final solution, the attempted genocide of the Jewish people of Europe. People were murdered on an industrial scale, primarily through the use of poison gas, in a process of cold, bureaucratic extermination. Beyond the camps, mobile killing squads known as the Einsatzgruppen followed the German army into the Soviet Union, carrying out mass shootings of over 1 million people. The Nazi war machine was fueled by the slave labor of millions more, and its occupation policies led to the deaths of tens of millions of civilians through starvation and reprisal killings. The empire was a project of total domination, aiming to re-engineer the demographic and cultural map of Europe. After 12 years and a devastating world war that cost over 70 million lives, the thousand-year Reich collapsed in total military defeat, its leaders facing justice at Nuremberg. Nazi Germany is now the ultimate historical warning, a symbol of humanity's capacity for industrialized evil. For 1,000 years, the Roman Empire was the center of the Western world, a beacon of law, engineering, and culture. But its unparalleled stability and prosperity were built upon a foundation of relentless military expansion and a brutal system of social control. The Roman legions were arguably the most effective military force in the ancient world. Their conquests were often marked by extreme violence, designed to crush resistance and serve as a warning to others. The complete destruction of Carthage at the end of the Punic Wars, where the city was razed and its people killed or enslaved, became a byword for total annihilation. Similarly, the suppression of the Jewish revolt culminated in the siege and sack of Jerusalem in 70 AD, an act of devastation that echoed for centuries. Julius Caesar's conquest of Gaul was a demographic catastrophe for the region, with ancient historians claiming that 1 million were killed and another 1 million enslaved. Slavery was the engine of the Roman economy, with as much as 1/3 of the population in Italy being enslaved at the empire's height. Slaves had no rights and were subject to the absolute will of their masters, performing backbreaking labor in mines, on farms, and as domestic servants. Mass crucifixions, like the one that followed Spartacus's slave revolt, were used as a public deterrent. The empire also perfected mass spectacle as a tool of social control. In arenas like the Colosseum, tens of thousands gathered to watch gladiators fight to the death and see prisoners and condemned criminals executed in elaborate and cruel ways, including being killed by wild animals. This bread and circuses policy kept the urban populace distracted and placated with free grain and brutal entertainment. After centuries of dominance, a combination of internal decay, economic crisis, and external pressures from migrating peoples led to the slow decline and eventual fall of the Western Roman Empire. The Roman Empire is now a set of foundations for law, language, and architecture upon which much of Western civilization is built. At its zenith, the British Empire was the largest in human history, covering 1/4 of the world's land area and ruling over 1/5 of its population. It was a global system of trade, governance, and military power, but its expansion and maintenance often involved acts of extreme violence and exploitation. The empire was frequently built and maintained through the suppression of dissent. In its North American colonies, this led to a revolutionary war, while in places like India, Ireland, and Kenya, uprisings were often met with overwhelming force. The empire's economic policies could be devastating. During British rule in India, a series of famines resulted in the deaths of tens of millions. While not always directly caused by the British, critics argue that rigid adherence to laissez-faire economic policies, forced crop cultivation, and the export of grain exacerbated the crises. The suppression of the Indian Mutiny of 1857 was particularly brutal, with widespread summary executions and rebels being publicly executed by being blown from cannons. The use of concentration camps was a tactic employed by the British during the Second Boer War in South Africa. Tens of thousands of Boer civilians, mostly women and children, were interned in these camps, where poor sanitation and lack of food led to the deaths of over 27,000. In China, to reverse a trade imbalance, Britain fought the Opium Wars to force the Qing dynasty to accept imports of the narcotic. This policy created widespread addiction and undermined Chinese sovereignty, all in the pursuit of profit from the tea trade. Later, during the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya in the 1950s, the British established a brutal system of detention camps where prisoners were subjected to torture, forced labor, and summary executions. After 2 world wars exhausted its resources and strengthened independence movements, the empire was gradually dismantled throughout the 20th century. The British Empire is now the Commonwealth, a voluntary association of independent states linked by shared history, language, and legal systems. It proves that an empire can present itself as a civilizing force while simultaneously profiting from famine, addiction, and systematic violence. Following the initial phase of Islamic expansion, the Umayyad Caliphate emerged as the first great Islamic dynasty. From their capital in Damascus, they presided over a massive empire stretching from Spain to the borders of India, the largest the world had yet seen. The Caliphate's expansion was incredibly rapid, driven by a skilled and mobile military that overwhelmed the exhausted Byzantine and Sasanian Persian empires. While conversion to Islam was not typically forced, the structure of the empire was inherently hierarchical and discriminatory. Under the dhimmi system, non-Muslims, primarily Christians and Jews, were granted protected status and religious freedom, but they were treated as second-class citizens. They were required to pay a special poll tax known as the jizya, were subject to various social and legal restrictions, and were barred from holding the highest offices of state. This system created significant pressure to convert, as becoming Muslim offered social and economic advantages. The caliphate's internal politics were also marked by extreme brutality. The dynasty itself came to power through civil war, and it maintained its rule with an iron fist. Revolts, whether political or religious, were crushed without mercy, most famously at the Battle of Karbala, an event that cemented the schism between Sunni and Shia Islam. Governors like al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf were notorious for their ruthlessness in suppressing dissent in Iraq, employing mass executions and terror to maintain order. The empire was officially an Arab-centric state, with non-Arab converts to Islam, the Mawali, often facing discrimination and being treated as inferior to Arab Muslims. This institutionalized inequality created widespread resentment that fueled its eventual downfall. The Abbasid Revolution, which overthrew the Umayyads in 750, was a bloody affair that saw almost the entire Umayyad royal family systematically hunted down and executed. The Umayyad Caliphate is now a period, a foundational era that established the political and cultural geography of the Islamic world. It was not an empire in the traditional sense of conquest, but an internal one, an absolute, totalitarian state that declared war on its own nation's past. When the Khmer Rouge, led by Pol Pot, seized control of Cambodia in 1975, they sought to create an agrarian communist utopia by completely resetting society to year zero. Their first act was to forcibly empty the cities. Millions of people were driven from their homes at gunpoint and marched into the countryside to work as slave laborers on collective farms. The regime abolished money, private property, and religion. It systematically targeted anyone associated with the old society. Intellectuals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, and even people who wore glasses, as they were seen as a sign of education. Family bonds were broken as children were separated from their parents and indoctrinated to report on them. Anyone suspected of dissent or being an enemy of the state was sent to notorious security prisons, like Tuol Sleng or S21, where they were systematically tortured to extract forced confessions before being taken to killing fields, like Choongak, to be executed. To save bullets, victims were often killed with shovels, pickaxes, or bamboo sticks. The combination of forced labor, malnutrition, inadequate medical care, and mass executions was catastrophic. In less than 4 years, the Khmer Rouge regime was responsible for the deaths of an estimated 1.7 to 2 million people. This represented nearly a quarter of Cambodia's entire population at the time. The regime's reign of terror ended in 1979 when the neighboring nation of Vietnam invaded, forcing the Khmer Rouge from power and exposing their atrocities to the world. The Khmer Rouge regime is now a case study in autogenocide, the act of a state destroying its own people. From the steppes of Mongolia to the killing fields of Cambodia, this journey through history reveals the many faces of imperial brutality. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment with your ideas for future topics. Thanks for watching.